Good afternoon, students of GBC. This is now week 10. We had a makeup lecture last week and we had our Zoom meeting, so now we're moving forward. Last week's lecture was about digital identity, and this week's lecture will follow up on that with the second part, which I've written in French for fun, part deux. I've been looking forward to this lecture for a long time. Because originally when I was asked to teach this course, I was thinking of putting this lecture in the middle at some point because it's based partly on a conference paper I presented about digital identity at the end of last semester at an international English conference in Daejeon. It went pretty well, so hopefully this one will too. I am going to upload my conference paper for you to look at, but just so you know that none of that content is really going to be on the exam or tested. It's just really to give you some, if you care, to look at a more academic and more intense approach to the subject. You can just get an idea in case, since you're seniors, in case you're thinking of going to graduate school and continuing your studies in business or something else. Not all of you are business students. There's a variety of majors here, whether it's economics or language or science. You just have to get a sense of what it's like to try and publish a paper or prepare for a conference. It's a painful process, but it's a quite rewarding one too, because once it's done, you have it, and it's under your name, and you can refer to it and you can use it in your studies or your research, or if you end up teaching in your classes. So today we're going to talk about digital identity, and this one is more of I guess, a College of Humanities type approach. Some of my background is cultural studies, so there'll be less of an orientation towards technology and business, and more about the meaning of things today when I tell you about digital identity. So first of all, right here I put a star beside the purpose. When you create a digital identity, you have to think about it more so than your actual identity, because you form your identity as you grow, and that's sort of connected to your psychological makeup and your environment. But to a certain extent, you don't get to choose your environment. You don't get to choose your parents or where you live necessarily. I didn't choose to be Canadian. I chose to live in Korea. But most of my personality and my identity was fully formed before I came here. And I didn't really have a choice there. That was just my environment and myself. The interaction between myself and my environment produced who I am. And I identify as a Canadian male, for example. When it comes to digital identity, you have a little bit more of a choice. Not always, but you do have choices in the sense that which environment and what purpose you're constructing your identity for will affect will be up to you. If you need money, or you're doing it because you're required to do it because of your education, for example. There are pressures that will cause you to do certain things to create your identity, and those are required, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. But in general, you have more choice. Therefore, you should think about, when you create a digital identity or you interact with other people, you should realize that those people are doing it on purpose, and they have a specific purpose. If you're from an area that's less technologically or culturally linked to the rest of the world, like I am, if you're more of a country boy or country girl, like I am, the interaction of people on the internet sometimes strikes me as fake or as false, but that's not necessarily that's one way of looking at it, but that's not necessarily true. There's a certain amount of facade. There's a certain amount of fakeness to everybody's identity, and we all know this. We all perform. I'm performing right now. I'm trying to be Professor Sullivan right now not necessarily the Jeremy Sullivan that you see in the evening, or if you bump into me in the department store or in a restaurant. I play different roles. And I'm also a parent. When I was younger, I was a party animal, for example. I identified as different things. I identified as a graduate student, and I identified as a student, a high school student. And when I was growing up, I used to go to church, so I identified myself as a member of a Christian church. These are all part of my identity now, too, because they're part of my memory. And digital identity also can do this. It can constitute a variety of things together, and you can also separate them into a good word to describe it that's used sometimes in psychology or in discussion of identity is to compartmentalize. A compartment is a separate, section where you store something, and one compartment can hold one thing, and another compartment can hold another, and a third can have another. So you can sort of separate yourselves, your identities, into different compartments. And some people are very good at this, and some people are not. And this was part of the main concept of my conference paper, was this idea that identity has certain purposes, and people try to sometimes have multiple identities, and they can actually disconnect themselves from those identities, and they can sometimes refute or dispute the other identity's behavior, right? Almost as if you're a mentally unstable person where you're arguing with yourself. But you can just, a simple example is, I'll just, as I often do, just take President Trump as an example, because he's just, not because he's an easy target and I'm trying to criticize him. I'm just saying anybody can do this, but he does this quite well, in particular. So he has this Twitter account called The Real Donald Trump, at The Real Donald Trump. And he appears in person in press conferences, and he issues memos, but not very often. But he makes announcements, he has official channels, and then he has his press conferences, which are usually interactions with the media, where they ask him difficult questions, and he accuses them of, being fake, of being fake news, and that the media is unfairly representing him, which is sometimes true, but we won't go there. So you got three already. You got the Twitter Trump, you've got the official channels where they release his information through the White House, and then you got the press conferences where he's doing interviews. Sometimes there's a helicopter behind him, sometimes he's standing at a podium, and so on. That's three, but there are many more too. You can go on. Of course, he does these rallies in big stadiums where, not right now because that's very dangerous, but he was doing these rallies where he would invite 10,000 of his supporters to a stadium, and then he would speak. And then that was a fourth version of him, if you want to call it a version. And these identities sometimes disagree with each other. Sometimes he says, I didn't say that. And, it's partly because there's different environments, and he's compartmentalized himself. So, if he's going to say something in the middle of the night, no, presidents didn't used to do that, but he will just go on Twitter, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, he will express himself. And that Donald Trump is a different one, usually, although I can say there's some consistency, but there's also some disconnect between the different versions that you see. And this is what one of the main ideas of my paper is that you have to be aware of what the purposes of each identity is. So we can anchor these different types of personalities and identities to different purposes. And obviously knowing how that works and being aware of it has consequences for how you behave. But since this is global business communication, it's a large part of how people do business, right? I know there's a really heavy political side to it, and there's a really heavy, safety side to it, considering all the misinformation going around about coronavirus and people's behavior and whether you should be allowed to go out or not allowed, and all these announcements that the WHO says one thing and the president says another thing, and your local government says another thing, and you personally think another thing. There's all these different versions of everything. Somehow we have to sort through all these things, and to understand that every time somebody puts out information through a communication channel, that it is normally tagged with an identity in one sense or another, in one way or another, is very important for you to understand if you're going to be able to navigate, whether it's in business, your personal life, in politics, or otherwise, how you're going to navigate through all this information. So, what can a purpose be? Well, there are so many I can't count. I'll give you a few examples. You create an identity so you can be tracked, so people can follow where you are and you can follow where you've been. This obviously has some consequences if somebody's tracking you and you don't want them to. But tracking yourself, if you've been all over the internet for years and years, and then 10 years later you want to find out which websites you visited because you can't remember, I mean, Google can do that for you if you keep your search history, or you're always logging in from the same IP, or you're identified in another way, you can track that. So, you can be tracked. You can create an identity to make money. You can do it as an escape. You see, some of these things are wildly different purposes. It can be a form of escapism, where your daily life or your life is not attractive, but you create an identity and you go online and you create this digital identity that you feel people respect and that people like, and that can give you satisfaction, and that can allow you to escape from your problems in your real life. Now, this is not necessarily a good thing, because escapism usually means that you neglect what we call your real life in favor of this other identity and this other life and this other world you create. And this was also a large part of my conference paper, because I was a little bit too involved in MMORPGs when I was younger. Shamefully, I sunk a lot of time and energy and money into those games, and there was an inversely proportionate relationship between Jeremy as a physical person and Jeremy as a character in a game. As my character got stronger and stronger and more famous and more powerful, the Jeremy in the physical world started to get less famous and less capable and weaker and weaker. And that was one of the consequences of having a digital identity that was taking over my life. But I escaped. I escaped my real life, and then I escaped the virtual life too, and returned, which was an important experience for me. You can use a digital identity to control or manipulate other people. This is one of the political purposes. If people think you're somebody and you're not, you can deceive people, you can control people, you can manipulate people. Sometimes that needs to be done for certain reasons, but in general, I would say that's a negative purpose. You can hide yourself, you can disappear, and you can pretend that you're someone that you're not. You can persuade other people through your digital identity, because it has a certain power over other people if you develop it. You can buy things, and of course, you can sell things. You can promote things. You can encourage people to see things, and you can promote things. You can entertain people. You can entertain yourself. You can entertain other people. And of course, one of the worst elements of digital identity is the bullying aspect. You can threaten people and you can abuse people using digital identity. That's the danger of having younger kids with Kakao Talk and chat rooms and stuff like that, is that I was a middle school student too. I wasn't always nice to other kids, and the kids weren't nice to me. But it would have made it much worse if instead of being bullied by 3 kids after school one day, that you were bullied by your entire class in one. That never happened to anybody that I've ever heard of, that an entire class or an entire grade. But you could end up with 100 people saying things to you and going after you. There's lots of horrible stories of this kind of stuff, because that doesn't happen in real life, except in very extreme circumstances. But it's not that hard to gather a group of people digitally that's a really big group, and that the person can really, it can be very, very damaging. It can even end up in somebody taking their own life because they've been harassed so severely and threatened or abused so severely by other people digitally. So this is another terrible consequence of having a digital environment that isn't controlled or isn't managed or regulated or doesn't have a policy that protects the individuals that are involved. But that's another story. We're just talking about the individuals here. So going forward, these are the 6 words that I chose. It didn't end up making it into my conference paper, which is part of the reason I'm talking to you now about it, is what do you call, like you can call it digital identity, but there's different options. You can, again, they can be anchored sort of to the purpose, is what are you trying to do when you create a digital identity? There's, an IP number is a digital identity, but that's much, much different than me logging into a game and having a name and a character that has is designed to look cool and has a sword and a shield and a helmet or something like that. Those are completely different concepts. So with underneath this idea of digital identity, we need to have some narrow definitions of what we're talking about. And these are the 6 words that I chose to distinguish between different types of online representations. I guess you could call them all sort of symbols or representative symbols of yourself or of a group, an institution, an organization, or a corporation. So when you're trying to create something that's sort of related to yourself, that you're representing your own personality in some way and you're expressing your feelings and your personality, then you would call it a persona. And persona is not a very old word. In the English language, it was Carl Jung and Ezra Pound, I believe, that I'm going to get the dates wrong, but it's early 20th century, so about 100 years ago, that Carl Jung, as a he sort of branched off from Freud with his own ideas about psychoanalysis, and he created these different aspects of human the psychological makeup of human beings, and he called them archetypes. And he believed that basically that a persona was the outward expression of your social personality. So how somebody appears is their persona. So if you create something it's like you, and it represents you in a way that's similar to your real personality, that you're expressing yourself into some sort of vessel on the internet, then that would be a persona. Right. So that's how you would use that word, I think, is the best way to use it, is if you're creating something where you could express your feelings and show your behavior, and it would be relatable to what you think you are in real life. A mascot, everybody knows what a mascot is probably, because we have these people that dress up as something, an animal or a monster or some sort of character, some sort of they dress up in a costume, and it's a symbol. It's an individual that is symbolic of usually a baseball team or any sports team, and in a stadium they run around and they entertain people, and that represents the company. But actually, a mascot originally it's an old term, and it actually means a good luck charm. So now we've appropriated the word mascot to represent like a franchise. It doesn't have to be sports. It can be, McDonald's had Ronald McDonald forever. It was a red-haired clown who would appear all over the place and entertain the kids and get them interested in eating McDonald's food and playing with the toys that went along with the Happy Meals. That was all business. It wasn't related to sports. They're just trying to promote their business. So that's what a mascot has become. But originally a mascot was essentially a talisman or a good luck charm that you would keep, and that would give you a benefit. So yeah, if you're going to choose something that represents, rather than a person, it represents your business or your organization, institution, etc., then perhaps mascot is a better word. Now, avatar is one of my favorite words. It's not because of the movie. I wasn't a big fan of the movie, actually, although it was fascinating, all the CGI and computer graphics that were done. It was visually incredible, but the story wasn't really compelling, in my personal opinion. Avatar is a word that comes from Hindu, and the original word is longer. I'm not sure I can pronounce it or say it properly, so I won't. But it's derived from a Hindu word, which means like a god projecting himself into him or herself into a physical form. So the way that we use avatar, I would say, is kind of the opposite in a way. Is so we have a tangible form, and we are human beings, and we project ourselves onto the internet in some sort of form. Usually, in this case, an avatar that would fit quite well with something that you were playing a game, and you had to choose some sort of representation that looked like it was physical, but it's digital. So you can see it. It can do things. It can make noises. It can speak. It has a face, but it's not your face. It can be a totally different thing. I mean, your avatar could be a dinosaur. It doesn't really matter. But that thing represents you in sort of a spiritual projection, like an astral projection, rather than the other way around, which is, I believe, how the word was originally used in Hindu, is that some spiritual being was representing themselves on Earth, but we use the avatar kind of in a reversed sense. But I love that word. It just has a cool sound. You can tell it's not a normal English word because avatar doesn't sound like an English word. It sounds like it might be Hindu. Profile. Now, profile comes from Italian, and I'm not Italian, but I believe the proper pronunciation is profilo. And profilo, I mean, a profile, you know what a profile is because it's usually information about you, but a profile actually means the kind of silhouette, the outline of something. When you draw the outline of something, or you look at it from the side, right? That's what we call a profile. But when we use it in this sense, we're talking about some basic, fundamental, or important information that identifies who you are. So if you put your picture up and then you put some information about yourself, ASL and everything else, which ASL means age, sex, location, which is not a very formal term, but if you just put your basic information, your citizenship, your education, I don't know, your like I said, your sex, your gender, how old you are, where you live, what your job is, and then you put a picture beside that, that's what we would call a profile. Okay, moving to the last two. A character is, of course, something that you could use the word to say character trait, like a quality that's representative of your individuality. And that's where the word originally comes from. It goes all the way back to ancient Greek. And I don't know how to say it in Greek, but something like, you can again tell, it sounds more like it could be a Greek kind of word, like karakater. Something like that is how you would pronounce it. I don't know. But, you know, the words that I know how to pronounce, like Socrates, right? Socrates, karaktara, or something like that. It's a different pronunciation, but that word goes all the way back, and it means that originally it was just an aspect of yourself, but then we created these things in stories, which we called characters, that sort of condensed certain qualities. Like the hero, he has certain qualities that we admire, and we inject them into that person, and that character type becomes a hero. What does heroic mean? Strong, brave, honest, generous, protective of innocent people, whatever it is, that's what we call a character. So when you create something that has certain qualities and you intentionally sort of create a new being or identity, and you infuse it and it becomes different, then it's not a projection of yourself or reflective of yourself, but you've got an entire new thing, and you're playing with that thing and people think you are that thing, which is what this is connecting with my life really uncomfortably close, is that's what I did. I had a character named Malleus, and Malleus was a paladin. And when people met me in real life, because I did meet many of these people in real life, the differences between some people and their characters was dramatic. Like, some people's personalities in the game, their character in the game was completely different. Some people were more similar, but the ones that surprised me the most were the people that I met, and their behavior in real life was much different than the way that they played in the game. And that's because they were role playing, right? They were actually, I met one person who in the game they played a woman, and in real life it was a middle-aged man. And it wasn't anything, I know that it shocked everyone, but he was a really nice guy. He was just wanted to pretend to be a woman, and there was nothing malicious about it. There was nothing criminal or illegal about it. He just wanted to play a woman. And is that okay? I mean, some people were upset about it, but he didn't really hurt anybody. So ultimately, the rest of us who played with him, once he admitted it, we were just like, okay, just, continue playing the way you played before. And, in the back of our heads now, we were like, well, the guy at the computer is really a guy, but in the game, he was a woman, his character was a woman, and he behaved like a woman. And that's what he wanted to do. And that's what a character is. That's quite a lot different than a persona, I would say. At least the way I would commonly use it. So finally, one more word. This is figure. And a figure is, again, a figure is a likeness. And I put these two together on purpose because figuring something is forming something. So, like I said, a character is kind of like a person that's created for a story. And a figure is someone that's created, I think they're almost the same thing. A character is a type of figuring. But when you figure something, it's almost like you're creating something, like I said, for a certain purpose. So a figure sometimes it's created to represent ideas more than it is to be a distinct new person. But like for example, when you're doing allegory, and I'm an English major, so I'm just going to choose an easy one for me, is when you're gonna write, well, we'll just take a modern day version again. If I'm going to write about somebody who might be offended, especially somebody who's a sensitive, powerful leader, let's just say Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin or another leader who doesn't really appreciate people representing them or talking or criticizing them. One of the ways that I could get around that would be just to make a story and call him, I would just call him Ronald Bump. The character's name is Ronald Bump. And it's a ridiculous name. But the whole story, you can tell that there's a reflection of a certain real person that has a similar sounding name. And throughout the whole story, the lessons would be learned and criticisms would be leveled. And then you would be able to, he's going to find out and he's going to know anyway, but you can always just claim, he's like, no, this is a fictional character. And I'm just figuring something out. I'm just representing, the flaws in the governmental system. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump. You should probably choose a different name than Ronald Bump because that's too close. But when they were writing, you can do it positively too. When Edmund Spenser wrote about Queen Elizabeth I, he used this figure called Gloriana. And Gloriana was this powerful, intelligent, witty, honest, virtuous woman, unmarried woman. And she was a fantastic character, which everybody admired and respected in his poem. But there was nothing really negative to say, and everybody could tell, this figure represented Queen Elizabeth. And so throughout her life, she had this figure that she was compared to, which was fictional, and it was not on the internet, but if she was living now, it would be this figure called Gloriana, which represents the best aspects of Queen Elizabeth the First, not the current one, Queen Elizabeth II. Right, so that's my explanation of how digital identity works and how you can understand the different purposes and the different types of digital identities you can use. A lot of this is psychological, but as I said, there has all the purposes. You can obviously take all of these things and you can use them for entertainment, but you can use them for business, and you can use them for politics, and you can use them for escape, and you can use them to persuade people, and you can use it for all those other purposes I mentioned, right? Okay, so that is the second lecture on digital identity. As I promised, I will be doing a write-up once I do the third part, because there's one more, about digital rhetoric, which will be about safety and censorship, discrimination, about how to handle the youth question, and a little bit of stuff about technology and business, which will wrap up this kind of three-part discussion of digital identity. When I do my lecture for you next week, I will also put together some notes because a couple students requested that. I know some of you like PPT. I'm not a big fan, but I may put together a few slides, but at least there'll be a write-up and a link to the file so that you can watch or rewatch these. I mean, the information comes sort of fast, so I don't think you need to rewatch too many times, but I'll do some summarizing and hit some of the main points that I talked about today and yesterday and next week, and then I'll sort of condense it and put it in a file so that you can refer to it for your final. And remember, we are going to do presentations, so next week I'm going to give you the instructions on the presentation, and I think the consensus was one more Zoom meeting would be good, especially considering there were some young people in Seoul that decided to go to a club, and one person was infected and had symptoms, and apparently we have maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe more people sick again here when we were almost down to zero. But some people made some bad decisions, so we all know that the semester is going to be fully online, and we will only see each other for the exam, and that's it. So another Zoom meeting might be wise, especially considering there were a couple of students absent last time. So the plan is to move forward. There's no homework this week. Next week I'll give you more instructions in the summary, and we'll wrap up digital identity, and then we'll move on to the next topic after that. That is your Friday afternoon, week 10 lecture. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again next week.